How did you come to this project? Niall Ferguson, historian, writer of many biographies, to be Henry Kissinger's chosen biographer.
It goes back a long time to another world city, London. I met Henry Kissinger in London at a party rather like this. And we found ourselves discussing the First World War, which is not the kind of thing you normally talk about at cocktail parties. He'd read a book I'd written about it. And our friendship began there when he came up with the idea of writing or having somebody write a scholarly biography. I was not his first choice, I must say. And indeed, I initially declined because I thought it would be an impossibly difficult task. But then he did something very Kissingerian, which was to write to me and say, "What a shame you've decided not to do this. Just as I'd made up my mind that you were the very man for the job, and just as I found 150 boxes of my papers that I thought I'd lost, and I was like a fish confronted by a nice fly. I bit into the hook. I went to Connecticut, looked at those papers, and within a matter of minutes realized I really had to write the book. They were so extraordinary."
And what was in those papers?
The first thing I came across was an extraordinary letter he'd written to his parents in the late 1940s, shortly after World War II. That was so revelatory that in some ways it remains one of the most important documents in the entire book. I think he put the best documents near the top of the box, mind you. So there was a diary of a trip to Vietnam in 1965, which simply made my jaw drop. I realized after skipping through a few pages that already in 1965, Henry Kissinger knew that the war could not be won and would have to be ended by diplomatic means. And the more I turned the pages, the more engrossed I became. Finally, I came to a document, a couple of pages long, that he had written just after witnessing the liberation of a concentration camp in Germany in 1945. He was in the US Army. He'd fled Germany just 7 years before as a refugee from Hitler. To be there witnessing the Holocaust at first hand was clearly a searing experience. And the short essay he wrote, I think for his own use, was entitled simply "The Eternal Jew," and was addressed to one of the Polish camp inmates that he had freed. So these documents together persuaded me, really in the space of an afternoon, that I had to write the book.
He also was an interrogator at that time, was he not?
He
was an investigator.
That's right. He was plucked out of the infantry where he'd been a simple rifleman and put into counterintelligence with the job of hunting down the most extreme Nazis in the period after the defeat of Germany, of denazification. And so one again has to imagine what an extraordinary thing for a German Jew who had been a refugee to be back in Germany in this extraordinary position of power at the age of just 22. I think this is a feature of the book that will strike even those people who have been his most adamant critics, and there may be some in this room. No matter how hostile your view may be of the foreign policy of the Nixon administration, you really will not fail to be touched by the story of Henry Kissinger's early life, and I think it will help you understand him better.
And how did it help you to understand him better? I mean, clearly, he chose to stay in Germany when he could have come back.
This is, in many ways, a surprise in itself. After being given the option to be demobilized and sent home, Kissinger decided to stay on in occupied Germany, first in counterintelligence and then at an instruction school for American soldiers. And he explained this to his parents, who were amazed, by saying that when he looked around the table and saw where his dead comrades had sat, he felt bound to stay longer in Germany until the job had been completed and their sacrifice had not been in vain. So this sense from very early on that something more had to be done than simply to defeat Hitler, one had to build a new and viable democratic Germany, was very strongly apparent in those letters.
That's also where he met a mentor who played a powerful role.
Fritz Kramer is one of the more colorful characters in this story. Kramer was another refugee from Nazi Germany who'd ended up in the US military, Kramer, however, had invented himself as a kind of ultra-conservative Prussian officer. He wasn't really, but in crossing the Atlantic, you can reinvent yourself. Yes. And Kramer was the one who saw that this young man, fresh out of Washington Heights, was brilliant. And it was Kramer who encouraged him to think of philosophy, to think of history, and then to think of applying to the Ivy League colleges when he came back from the war. Kramer crops up throughout the book as a kind of almost a Mephistopheles figure, but a Mephistopheles who begins to worry that his brilliant pupil is rising too high. And there are these extraordinary letters from Kramer to Kissinger in German at periodic intervals in the book as Kissinger rises, warning him against the temptations of worldly success.
It obviously didn't take, did it? There is also this, the idea of how this impacted his emerging worldview. Can you look back? This volume is 1923 to 1968. That's when he enters the White House as the National Security Advisor to Richard Nixon. This includes coming back, this includes Harvard, this includes marriage and divorce and other aspects of his life. But when you look at what the Holocaust and the Nazi experience and the war experience did to him, can you now look, as you look at the present time, from Nixon through 2015, an emerging sense of world order and how that is shaped?
Order, World Order, after all, is the title of his most recent book. The concept of international order is there right from the outset in his doctoral dissertation, A World Restored, which talks about how Europe was reordered after the defeat of Napoleon. And the key idea, I think, that Kissinger's trying to communicate is that there needs to be international order because the alternative is chaos and conflict. The big threat to international order comes from revolutionary powers. Napoleon had been one of those, and so, of course, in his time had Hitler been. Writing about the Cold War as a young academic, he spent a lot of time, I think, trying to work out if the Soviet Union was still a revolutionary power. And over time, I think, he began to realize that it might no longer be one, and that it might be possible to bring it into a new American-designed international order. The key point to notice, though, is that in this order, different states have different internal characteristics, and that's okay. Kissinger was not one of those Americans who imagined the entire world could be remade in the image of the United States.
They all had their own history,
right,
and their own narrative.
Kissinger has a great line which really stuck with me. History is to states what character is to individuals. It gives them their distinctive identity. If you don't study history, you can't really understand other states. And this brings us back to your fantastic interview with Vladimir Putin. You can't really understand the Russian president if you don't know Russian history. And every time Putin explains himself, he tends to do it with reference to history. So does the Chinese president Xi Jinping, whose visit to the United States was a little less spectacular than Putin's or the Pope's, but probably will turn out to have been the most important of the three. The Chinese, too, always tend to explain their thinking and their strategy in historical terms. Kissinger's point has been for years that Americans are bad at this, and most American policymakers don't really think historically. I think his contribution has been to make history central to the whole idea of international order and international relations. And I suppose in that sense, this is a book about what I would call applied history. And I, as a historian, naturally have an axe to grind here because I sense that as a discipline, it's viewed at my institution as a kind of poor relation compared with mighty economics. Well, this book is really partly an argument against that ranking. Really, history should rank above the social sciences.
You make the point that this is from 1923 to 1968, before he has power. Before he has power. I mean, the famous quote he had about the Harvard faculty. Washington was no different than the Harvard faculty, except the stakes were so much higher in Washington, but the conflict was the same. The idea of power and the exercise of power will live out through the second volume of this. This volume is entitled The Idealist. I mean, what is the evidence that Henry Kissinger a man we think of as one who understands, manipulates, advises power, not one who brings a sense of idealism to statecraft.
Well, this is really the most surprising thing about the book, and the reason that you should grab free copies while they're still available, and then rush home and order at least 5 copies for yourself and your relatives.
And take 5 people home, because you'll need 5 people to take them back.
They are quite heavy, these books, but they repay the carrying. The key idea here is that he is not, as he's generally portrayed, the arch realist, the 20th century Bismarck, Machiavelli, USA. I came into the book thinking
he's not that between 23 and 68. We'll see whether he becomes that.
Volume 2 is unwritten. It's about 60% researched, and I don't really make up my mind until I'm sitting at the coalface reading through my material and writing. And so I don't know what Volume 2's subtitle will be, but I'm absolutely convinced that you cannot understand him if you do not see the enormous debt that he had to German idealist philosophy, to the experience of the 1930s. There's a wonderful line where he describes the appeasers as realists. He says that the appeasers thought they were great realists, which is very damning of foreign policy realism. And then this really crucial part of the argument. He was an anti-materialist. Kissinger was hostile to Marxism-Leninism, which was the materialist philosophy of the Soviet Union, but he was also hostile to its capitalist versions. All those people at Harvard in the 1950s who said, we'll win the Cold War if we have faster growth and greater prosperity than the Soviets can offer. Kissinger's argument was no, the Cold War has to be won because freedom is superior as an ideal to what the Soviets have to offer.
So who was right?
I think he was right about that. I think
many will argue that, in fact, it was the economic base that was not there that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, I'm by training an economic historian, and you'd expect me to buy that. I more and more think, and this will be a theme of Volume 2, that we cannot understand the Cold War in those terms, that the economics really weren't decisive, and what killed the Soviet Union was not low productivity. What killed it was a fundamental demoralization, a deep, deep loss of belief on the part of the population. This is a variant of Tom Stoppard's wonderful argument in Rock and Roll. But I think there's a kinship, actually, between Kissinger's view of the Cold War and Stoppard's in that wonderful play. It was about ideas. And what happened in 1989 was ultimately a collapse of an idea more than it was a collapse of an economic system.
But if he is an idealist, and your argument is that this is the primary discovery you have made, how is the idealism expressed?
Well, a good example of this is the case of Vietnam. Vietnam in the late 1950s and early 1960s looked like a simple case of self-determination. And American policymakers thought that they should uphold the independence of South Vietnam on the principle of self-determination and to stop other countries going communist as a result of the so-called domino effect. And initially Kissinger bought into this line, just as he believed that Germany should be reunified if Germans wanted to be reunified. He thought that the South Vietnamese should have their own state if they wanted to remain independent of the North. So that was a classic Wilsonian, Woodrow Wilsonian idea. The interesting thing is to notice how quickly Kissinger abandons it when he gets close to seeing what's happening in Saigon. And I find one of the most exciting things to write in this book was Kissinger's disillusionment when he went to Vietnam in 1965. It's really quite a shocker to find him flying around over Viet Cong positions in a heavily armed helicopter, not the kind of thing Harvard professors do by and large, and realizing from watching the war on the ground that it can't be won, and that the people running the war are in a kind of delusional state about the nature of the war.
In what capacity did he go to Vietnam?
He was invited as a kind of advisor by the then ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge. And it really was an interesting thing for him to do because there wasn't terribly obvious glamour or glory in going and trying to help at this point. It's a moment when he moves from being a public intellectual to being an insider who's advising. From 65 onwards, he's conflicted because publicly he defends policy, but privately he thinks it's all over.
one of the interesting things about that is that in Vietnam, if it in 1965 shaped his idealism, it was Vietnam and the long effort to find a peace that has shaped some animosity and dislike of him because of a belief that he could have ended this war earlier.
A key argument that I'll have to develop in Volume 2 is whether or not there were easy early exits. It's pretty clear that there were not at the point in 1969 when he and Nixon set to work, and nobody really thought that there was. So one has to always ask oneself a very Kissinger question. What are the alternatives available at the time? Not what would we ideally like to do, but what is actually viable at any given time. And I'm very struck by something that he wrote before becoming embroiled in Vietnam about what he called the problem of conjecture. And this is a critical idea that every decision maker in the public sector and private sector has to grasp. The problem of conjecture is this, that when you take a difficult decision, when you do something hard in the short term, to avoid some worse outcome in the future, the payoffs will not be particularly good if you succeed. If you avert disaster, people generally aren't very grateful because the disaster doesn't happen and they don't experience it. The temptation, therefore, is to kick the can down the road, as we say today, to play for time and hope that something turns up. Every big strategic decision has that character that you can't really be sure what lies down each fork of the road. You just have to try to decide which the lesser evil is. And that sense that diplomacy, statecraft, is very often a choice between evils seems to me to be a very, very important way in which I can frame the second volume, because I don't think there was an easy way out of Vietnam.
How do you define the quality of his mind?
I have to admit that Kissinger is one of the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered. I remember...
Who's in the top 5?
Well, you, Charlie, obviously, and Nicholas, and Andrew Wiley, my agent, and then Larry Summers and Henry Kissinger. I think that would be the 5.
And all the book buyers that might want to purchase this book.
It's a formidable mind. It has an ability to think in multiple dimensions. Remember three-dimensional chess in Star Trek? Well, I think Henry Kissinger has the ability to play that game. The ability to think simultaneously about all the major strategic players in the world is a very rare ability. Most people inhabit rather narrow intellectual silos, and this has never been true of Kissinger. And I find that. Now,
is this connecting the dots, so to speak?
I think it is the concept of linkage that is really appropriate to think of here. It became a big part of what he and Nixon and later Ford tried to do, to connect what they were doing with the Soviets to the opening to China, which is really one of the key episodes in the next volume, to the Middle East, to Vietnam, and figuring out how you come up with a strategy that links all the problems that you have to grapple with. That's the real challenge of grand strategy. And I think you'd have to say, if you looked at our present predicament and our present non-strategy, that it really is very difficult to do. One could see potential linkages between the problems that the United States faces today, but nobody's really drawing them. And that, I think, is one reason why we are in a somewhat strategy-free zone.
How would you define the quality of his ego?
Well,
ego.
One of the things I came to understand about Kissinger's ego was that he spent a great deal of time doing self-deprecating jokes that people around him took literally. If you have a penchant for irony, the United States is a very dangerous place. Because anything that you may say as self-deprecation, someone somewhere will quote back at you as if you meant it. I mean, the best example of this I can think of is a famous line, notorious line, in which he said, the illegal we can do immediately, the unconstitutional takes longer. This has been a kind of standard quotation for indignant left-wing tracts for many years. But when you go back to the original document from which this comes, which was a discussion from my recollection with some Turkish diplomats, you realize that it's a joke. like sex, power rather.
Sometimes they go hand in hand. I think it was Kissinger who said
that power...
Sex is the ultimate... No, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac.
Power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. It's the most famous thing that Henry Kissinger said. And it's actually a joke. Because when you see the places where he says it in his interview with Oriana Fallaci, what he's really saying is, I'm not attractive. It's power that is the ultimate aphrodisiac. If I didn't have the power,
but
he
also
wouldn't be the starlets.
Yeah, he also told her, that he saw himself as the man coming in to save the town.
There's something to be said.
This is him describing himself.
Yes, but there's something to be said for reading that whole interview as one of those days when exhaustion gets the better of a brilliant man, and a good interviewer gets the better of the exhaustion. And I'm sure that we'll never find, because it perhaps never existed, the original tape of that interview. But if we ever do, I shall include it as a CD with Volume 2. I'd love to hear the original, wouldn't you?
Well, it's an interesting thing about Henry and criticism. I mean, he famously said, I think this was about Sally Quinn at the time, who was writing these profiles in the Washington Post. Sometimes when they write about you, you want to kill them. At other times, you want to kill yourself.
I think there's a fascinating chapter in the history of fame to be written in the next volume of the book. I touch on it in the introduction. There was a period when Henry Kissinger was one of the best known and most highly regarded Americans, when his opinion poll ratings were far in excess, not just of the leading politicians of the day, but of the leading sportsmen and television personalities. This was the Super K phase. He appeared repeatedly on the covers of Time and Newsweek, often as a superhero.
Occasionally in Hollywood.
And he was frequently to be seen in the most glamorous of circles at the premiere of The Godfather, with Annie McGraw on one arm. It's a sort of, it's a period of hubris, really, because for this previously dry academic who specialized in the Congress of Vienna to suddenly be in the limelight in this way must have been intoxicating.
This is not in this book, but I mean, the point of this book also is to see if in the early years between 23 and his birth and 68 when he walked into the White House, there are things that suggest the future. I mean, that's really what you're looking at. And how does the early years compare with the later years in terms of values you think he had? I mean, is there an ideology at work with Henry Kissinger?
The best way I can answer that, and maybe this is an appropriate note on which to conclude, since I've gone way over 140 characters, and the other parties...
And everybody has dinner to go to.
There must be empty parties somewhere in the neighborhood. It's this. I found in his papers an unpublished book about Bismarck. He only published a part of it. And this book is a kind of wrestling match between Kissinger and the man he was most fascinated by, but came to view most critically, Bismarck. The reason the book never got published was that he couldn't finish it. And there are some extraordinarily tortured pages. I've actually included in the book all the corrections and the crossings out, the deletions, because they illustrate his grappling with the central problem. And the central problem is if you pursue a truly realist policy, if all you do is say, I'm going to pursue the national interest without any moral constraint, as Bismarck essentially did, Kissinger concluded you would ultimately be lost. You would lose popular legitimacy and you would not preserve or build an international order that could survive. I think that's a great insight. And perhaps the key to Volume 2 will be to see how far that insight applied to his own experience in government.
Okay, I have one last question, though. What is his reaction to Volume 1?
Well, you'll notice he's not here. Many people, when I said I was writing a biography of Henry Kissinger, said, well, you will certainly end up in a huge and bitter row with him. And schism is unavoidable.
You're in for it, young man.
there was a good deal of Cassandra-like prophecy. I think there are parts of the book he dislikes intensely. And I suppose it's just as well, because if he liked it 100%, I probably would have failed. But I think what he can live with is the account I've given of his thought. Ultimately, a book like this has to be an intellectual biography first and foremost. Some reviewers wanted more of his private life. I think the percentages are about right. A man like Henry Kissinger, driven intellectually as he was, is 90% concerned with thought. That may be less true in Volume 2, when he leaves the world of the academy and enters the realm of power. But in Volume 1, he's concerned with the great intellectual problems that he set out to grapple with: the philosophy of idealism, history, and how international relations, how those things function.
Niall, thank you and congratulations.
Thank you very much, Charlie.